welcome to tell us more about that. You are here for part two of our conversation with Dr. Chris Wilson. This is part two, so we suggest if you haven't done so already, go back and listen to last week's episode, which was, wait for it, part one.
Part one.
Part one. So the conversation evolves in a lot of different directions, but it definitely gets more personal in the second hour, which is this episode. So if you haven't checked out part one, go listen to part one. It's pretty foundational for some of the topics that we get into on a little bit more of a personal level here on this episode. So enjoy. Chris Wilson. Again.
Yeah, so I came up with, when I was doing this work with abusive guys, you would get to this place with them where they would want to know, how can I start to heal the relationship with my spouse if their partner stayed with them? And so we would have these conversations about, you can't just say, I'm sorry. Because so many of these good guys would say, I'm sorry that I hurt you. I'm sorry that I did this. And then it's like, I said I'm sorry. Why are we still talking about it? Like, don't you believe me? And so I came up with what I called the 4 steps to apology. The 4th step, which I think is the most unique piece. And the first step is you have to be fully accountable. So no minimizing, no blaming, no denying. And that's right out of the Duluth Power and Control Wheel. And the second step is you have to express an awareness of impact. Because so many folks, and from my perspective, we're now getting out of just working with abusive men, and we're just human beings in general. When I apologize, I want the person I'm apologizing to know that I didn't mean it. And whenever I focus on my intent and I don't talk about impact, I'm basically saying, yeah, I know you were hurt and everything, but I didn't mean it. And so the person who's being apologized to experiences this minimization of their own personal experience. So from my perspective, we have to be fully accountable. The second step is we have to express an awareness of impact, and we have to let ourselves be coached by whoever it is that we're apologizing to. We have to be open to them correcting us and saying, well, no, I wasn't frustrated. I was fucking pissed off. Like, okay. All right. So, and then the third step is we have to express an awareness of the impact on ourselves, which is regret. And if the impact on yourself was not that you felt regret, then why are you apologizing in the first place? If that makes sense. And then the last step, and the one that I think is really cool, is the notion of you have to say to the person that you're apologizing to, I have thought about what led me to doing this in terms of my own dynamics and like who I am. If at some point you ever want to talk about that, I'm open to that. I don't want to put that on you now because that can sound too much like I'm trying to minimize the impact. But if you're ever interested in that, I'm open to that. And quite honestly, if you ever want to talk about what has gone on between the two of us and how we got to this point of me acting in the way I acted, and when I say we, I'm meaning like how did I get to that place? I'm totally open to it. And that 4th step is one that, from my perspective, in any relationship is so beautiful. And really the reason I wrote the book is because a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine, a guy who I've been composing music with for, going on like more than 10 years. We were hanging out one night and he was talking about a disagreement that he and his wife had, and it stemmed from a camping trip, and he had played poker and stayed up all night and not come to bed in the tent and snuggled with her, which was like one of her favorite things to do. And she kept bringing it up, and he kept saying, I'm sorry. Like, I really am sorry. And so I said to him, man, yeah, I've never told you about these 4 steps, but I think you're missing that 4th step. And this light bulb went off. And so he went home and he talked to her about how he totally got it, that at the beginning of their marriage, he wasn't really ready to be married. And so he was sort of still doing single guy stuff. And she felt like, what the fuck, dude? Are you with me or are you not? Because you just keep going out and doing things with other people, and like you're not invested in the household. And he was like, look, I get it that when I acted that way, it probably brought up a bunch of your memories of when we were first married. And that's like, whoa, if that happened, I totally get it. And I want you to know I'm aware, and I'm working really hard at not, I don't want you to think I'm like backsliding. And he said she just broke out and was like, oh my, yes, you get it. Like, and he said, we've never talked about it since. We're closer than we ever have been. He was like, you need to write this. This needs to be a freaking book. And that's literally when I decided, oh, maybe it would be helpful, because he's not abusive at all, right? He's not an abusive guy. But from a relationship perspective, I mean, you think about a conflict, how often do we talk about why we did what we did in terms of ourselves? And then talk about what we're doing to try to make sure that doesn't happen again. That's that piece, Jen, when I mentioned, instead of saying, I'm going to not do it again, why? What are you doing to try to make sure that doesn't happen again?
Yeah. I with my own trauma history and my own upbringing, I never learned how to have healthy conflict until this relationship. And in the beginning, I was working with a different therapist, and I was telling her about a disagreement or an argument.
She's going to be a guest on the podcast, actually.
No, it's
a different one.
A different one. And she would always say, "Well, Jen, just remember, connection before correction." I was like, no, he needs to know that I didn't mean to do that, and this is why I did it. And so I love that fourth piece is, I would love to talk about this with you, about maybe what led me here, if or when you're ready to. Because my apologies for a very long time were self-soothing for me. They were, well, of course I didn't mean to do that. I did that just because of blank. And I was explaining why I may have acted a certain way, rather than, and we still talk about it, but.
And you've done that before. Like I have a couple memories of like large disagreements that we got into at the beginning of our relationship. And she would, when she was ready to like acknowledge and talk, she would end it with, whenever, if ever you need to talk about this, the door's open. And that is like, it's the most refreshing thing to hear, even when you're angry and frustrated. When they say that, it's the most humble, selfless act you could do in that moment, that gives the person some autonomy, which we all need in those situations, to feel like, okay, well, I can talk to her about this. Like we can make sure that this is fully fleshed out, and she's not just kind of checking a box and moving on. It's a powerful, I love that.
Yeah, I'm not just being apologized to so that we can move to the next thing. Like, the apology is actually being used as an opportunity for us to grow together, to have a moment of intimacy. Because what is intimacy? Shared emotional vulnerability.
Yeah.
So, when
apology.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I say in the book is apologies are not a moment in time. They are a process.
Yeah.
This is not about I'm sorry. It's about looking back. It's about looking forward. And as we move forward, being willing to look back and be humble. And like you said, Jen, not talking about what I did because of what's out here, but talking about what I did because of what's in here.
Mm-hmm.
Chris, I'm interested, because I bet we could go on and on about this one too, but I understand the concept of like it being like this idea of like an ongoing thing, and like this living apology type ideal, but there is a point where it does need to have some closure, right? So like if the person keeps re-engaging and keeps bringing it up and keeps kind of reliving that insecurity now that's seated in them, like at what point is the person who did the wrongdoing able to say, I've apologized as in the most genuine way I possibly can. We've talked about this multiple times. Like, what do you need to close this? Like, how would you close the loop?
Well, see, that's just it. I think once you talk about the why in terms of yourself, rarely does your partner need to continue to bring it up, unless they're seeing indications that are consistent with you're not doing the work that you said you were going to do. And so what, another thing I'm going to write about in the book is the notion of informational thinking. And it's just essentially consistent curiosity. So if my partner keeps coming back to me and bringing this up, instead of saying, we got to get some closure on this, I would say, no, we don't. I've got to wonder what's driving this constantly coming up. And am I playing a part in this? What's underneath this? And I genuinely want to get to know my partner, and I genuinely want to be vulnerable. And so let's have a conversation, because I would suggest there's nothing never needs to have the loop closed. We always have to be open to talking about experiences. And does it get exhausting sometimes? Potentially it does. And might you make the decision that this isn't the person for me? Right? That there's something that's just not working here? Yeah, absolutely. You might. But I think, and I'm both speaking from my personal experience and from the work that I've done. I think when you are really genuine about that fourth step, your partner doesn't feel the need to continually bring it back up, because they've seen this very genuine desire to not just make sure it doesn't happen again, but you've identified why it did and what you need to do to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
I again, with my own trauma history, like relational dating trauma,
Yep.
pre-Tony, obviously.
Thank you.
All of this just like hits so hard home. And when you were talking earlier about that you would stay too, it's like I feel like I've like shaken some people to be like, it wasn't me. Like it made so much sense that I was there. And now hindsight, I'm like, oh my God, I don't even recognize who that person was. And we've even had conversations where Tony's like, I can't envision you being in this situation. I was like, I can't even either. And it's refreshing, and it's a huge sense of relief of like, okay, people that have either gone through this and have a big enough platform are able to say like, this makes sense. Or people that haven't gone through it and they've just researched it and studied it and they've made life's work out of it, are saying like, this is huge. And half of the time you're talking about domestic violence. And that's why I had asked to clarify, are we talking about both psychological violence and physical violence? Because there's been so many fewer conversations going on about the psychological piece of it, and it's incredibly long-term lasting impact. And it frames who you are as a person. It frames how your brain processes information. And the physical violence is horrible, and you can die from that. Like it will eventually potentially lead to death. And the psychological violence, it can last an entire lifetime.
Yeah, to me, it's a both and. We've got to keep focusing on physical. We have to ramp up the focus on the psychological, emotional, financial, because it has a similar impact on the defense circuitry in terms of sensitizing us. Particularly if you've got any kind of trauma history in the past, you're going to feel like you're the problem. And even if you don't, you're going to feel like you're the problem. Like I had a woman come up to and say to me in the prison, she said, I appreciate, everything that you're trying to do here, but I just think I'm too fucked up to benefit from it. And that just that like hit me like, whoa. And I remember saying to her, I don't see you as fucked up. I see you as having been fucked with. And that's a huge difference. And I heard myself saying that, and I was like, oh my gosh, that goes for like every victim of abuse I've ever worked with. They feel fucked up, but they've just been fucked with, and their brains are doing what brains do when we suffer abuse. We take responsibility for it. We question ourselves. We feel as though there's something we could have done. And all these things are factors into why we stay, why we don't just leave. The psychological, emotional, the threat to status piece. It's really important that we ramp up, from my perspective, conversations about how pervasive it is and how damaging it is, how traumatizing it is.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you see that happening? Like, I feel like a lot of the education and conversation around trauma and the impact of psychological and physical and sexual violence happens reactionary to the incident. So this seems like a topic that everyone needs to be educated on in some capacity so that you can recognize some of these indicators when you start to see them if you're the victim, but also as the abuser. I would venture, I mean, I'd be interested actually to hear your take on this. When you were working with abusive men, how many of them didn't even realize what they were doing was abusive? How many of them had to have like the light go off and be like, holy shit, I didn't.
Rough guess, 10%.
Okay, so most of them it was intentional and they knew.
You know, because most of them, the vast majority of them, their verbal abuse was, and their control was, is noticeable.
Yeah.
Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I had clients who would try to justify, well, doesn't everybody get angry for, oh, are you telling me now we can't even get angry anymore? Well, I mean, there's a difference between getting angry and calling your wife a fucking whore because she went to lunch with a friend at work. And again, I apologize for the language, but these guys, their language is intense, and it's not everyday normal stuff.
No.
You know, you can get angry about things, and you can express that anger in ways that are healthy. And then there's ways that you express it that are abusive.
Yeah.
And so most of my clients, they knew. And really what was important was when they knew what they were doing, they knew that they were having an impact, and they didn't like it. The clients we really struggled to work with were the clients who either A, just didn't get it. Like they really didn't, Tony, and the light bulb never came on.
Yeah.
Or B, they knew and they just didn't care. Most of our clients, by the time they got to us, they knew deep down they'd done something wrong. And treatment was not about convincing them that they'd done something wrong. It was about giving them permission to see what they knew they had done. And so I really don't buy the whole, well, I had no idea I was having this much impact. Like,
It's not
I
the
just,
norm.
I just,
I like that actually. That takes away a lot of that assigns a lot more accountability for the individual, which is good. You are let's say you're a parent and you have kids in elementary school, middle school, high school, college, whatever else. Like from an educational perspective, what would you recommend? How do you expose them to learning about this in a way that's not like a brochure you would get at the health clinic? Like, how would you introduce this in a easy to digest way?
Yeah. Oh man, the cynical side of me just kicked in and went, well, first of all, you have to make sure there's none of this going on in your family.
Right. Yeah. Well, exactly.
Right.
That's true. Yeah.
I was actually thinking about this on my fast-paced drive home from work here. Is my personal experience with it so far is it starts generationally within a family, and then it bleeds out relationally to partners and whoever.
Yep.
So like I was thinking of the men in your groups or the men that you've worked with that would never come to terms with like, this is just what it is. It doesn't bother me. It's learned, it's experienced behavior. It's been, approved along the way. They've been validated that this is good. And I was thinking too, I work in an elementary school right now, and I've done a handful of functional behavior assessments. So the function behind a behavior, and these are children, and they're not abusive men, but there is a function behind a behavior. And I struggle still. We talked about it this morning of, well, men that are abusive were likely victims of abuse themselves. I'm like, I'm giving grace to these abusers, but I'm thinking of children specifically. But there is a function behind certain behaviors, and whether that function is a healthy one or a non-healthy one, an abuser, there is a function. They get this person to stick around. They get this person to lean fully into them. There's a function, and it's not a positive one, but not to remove blame or responsibility, but there's reasoning, whether they are aware of it or not, that they continue on these paths.
Yeah.
It works
Yeah.
for them in some
If I could just
capacity.
vamp off of that, but Tony, I do want to come back to your question is like, how do we deal with this?
Yeah.
But Jen, you just brought up a really important piece from my perspective, which is what's underneath all of this.
Mhm.
So I used to say to guys when they would come into group, in their intake, I would say, look, I have a belief about human beings in general. We all want to feel understood, cared about, and loved. Not all the time. Sometimes we just want to be understood. And if you don't agree with me, go to France, where they don't speak a whole lot of English, go buy groceries. You will realize you would just like to be understood, right? And so then we talk about in your marriage, in your relationship, or whatever it is that brought them there, do you feel loved? And most of them did not.
Mm.
And so what we would talk about was your patterns have been about short-term interest, short-term getting what you want. And when you get what you want, that feels to you as though your partner cares about you. But that's actually not, it's a myth. And so the reason why you don't feel loved is because in the moments when you think you're being cared about, your partner is just trying to appease you. And so that doesn't feel like love, because love is about vulnerability. And if you're not open to being vulnerable, and if you're not open to not getting what you want, it's going to be really, really hard for you to be happy. And most of my clients were not happy people. Most abusive individuals are not at their core happy people. And so that you could see on people's faces when that resonated. And I never did, research on this, but my gut always said, if that resonated, I felt like I can make a difference with this person. This is somebody that I think can benefit from being here in group, because we're going to help you look at those patterns, Jen, like you mentioned. And we're going to try to help you see that most of your patterns are very short-term focused. They have nothing to do with the long-term goal of feeling loved. So, we did not come up with it, but that whole deal, do you want to be right or do you want to be married? Right? It's not about being right. It's about understanding and negotiating and giving up sometimes what you want and letting your partner. I don't know if you guys have read John Gottman's stuff, but man, he wrote this book called Why Marriages Succeed or Fail. And it's brilliant. And I love one of the tenets of why a marriage works, or why any long-term marriage works, is because you support your partner's dreams. I'll tell you, my partner wants to potentially have a career shift. And so it is incumbent on me to support that dream and do whatever I have to do. So like at one point, Meg said, I want to go to graduate school and get a graduate degree from Oxford. And, we've all, yeah, right.
Yeah.
And this was a while back. This was before COVID, thankfully. And I remember at the time thinking, okay, like, wow, that's going to be like, I don't know how you're going to do that. But as soon as I started to have doubts, I was like, hold on, dude, this is something she's dreamt about. Throw away any and all doubts. Like, don't even have them, because we're going to make it work. And it's going to be awesome. And we're going to do this. And we did. And it was awesome. And she now has a degree from Oxford. Like, how freaking cool is that?
That's
Freaking cool.
amazing.
Yeah.
Right? So I think what happens when we're caught up in being too controlling, when we're caught up in being abusive, we're like, well, what about me? When you're over there in England for a month studying over there, what about me? Like, well, it's not about me. I'm in this partnership. I'm in what I hope will be a lifelong relationship. And there are these moments of sacrifice. And I think folks who struggle with abuse, that is so freaking threatening. So, we don't even have time. God, we'd have to do a whole other podcast on the narcissistic box and redefining narcissism, because I would suggest guys, when they are abusive, they struggle with their narcissism. They cannot see themselves as separate from their image. And so if they get accused of being who they think they are not, irresponsible or not supportive, or they just lose it. As opposed to, yeah, you know what? Every now and then I don't live up to my image, and that's because I'm human, and I hate it when that happens. And it is what it
I
is.
was very invested in this conversation, again, just from my own personal experience. But there's so many things that you've brought up or that we've talked about that pop up, I think, in our relationship. And again, it's validating to hear like, oh gosh, there is reason that I'm struggling with me personally, I'm struggling with some of these things. And
Yeah.
Tony going back to school and for clinical psych and us moving. I mean, we've had these exact conversations, and in my brain, I quite literally said, well, what the hell about me? Like, what about me? And it took a long time. It took weeks for me to like move past myself, to say, to be able to be compromising and selfless enough in a relationship, because that was never safe to do before that. I couldn't do that. I wasn't allowed. I was never safe enough to do that. And so to say, I can stand next to you while you do this big thing and know that I'm coming along with you, rather than like being dragged or hidden behind you. I mean, it took and I think for Tony, and he was patient enough but it took a long time. He was like, what is happening?
Well, and it's also, it creates this dynamic then for the other individual where you start to wonder, should I even be asking this? Is this a selfish ask? Am I asking someone? And that was kind of the mental process for me with this of, if I ask to do this, will I be asking her to compromise her dream? And if that was the case, then I honestly don't think I ever even would have asked.
Yeah, that's the tension, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's this massive balance, but it all came down to what you said, Chris. It's vulnerability, and you've got to both be able to be 100% honest with each other. Because if you're not, the true feelings will manifest, and they'll manifest at a point where you're not able to actually sustain and deal with them.
Yeah, I agree. And and it works both ways. When I wanted to leave my private practice and start this new thing, Meg was like, yeah, you're going to rock this. Not once did she ever say, I'm sorry, your income's going to be what?
Yeah.
Right? Like, I'm sorry, you're going to stop doing those lucrative forensic evaluations and seeing clients on a regular basis, who even when they don't show up, they still pay you. And like, you're going to rely on, and my income dropped significantly. Right. And when COVID hit, my income dropped significantly, and she's always supported that dream and always been like, you've got this. If there's anything I can do to help you and get your name out there. And it's just been, it cuts both ways, I guess, or maybe cuts is the wrong word. It goes both ways. It goes both ways.
I've just got this burning question that we started before I hit record. You touched on, and it got me curious. The traditional, I think, understanding and belief of abusers, and I would actually say we could do this with abusers and victims, is they are almost grown into this lifestyle. They were abused as kids, or they were victims in another relationship, and they just perpetuate this cycle. Is that on both sides of the aisle? Is that what you find, that these men that you've worked with have been victims of abuse, and the women that you worked with in the prison, they sought out that type of person to just perpetuate this what's normal and natural?
I'm so glad you asked the question, because the answer to the first is sometimes, and the answer to the second is never.
That's awesome.
I've never worked with somebody who sought out an abusive partner. Not once. And people say, well, they're seeking it out because it's familiar to them. No, they're not, because it's miserable. Yeah. I mean, it's totally fucking miserable. And you don't seek out misery. And people are like, well, but that's what's comfortable to them. No, what's comfortable are the moments where they feel loved. The good moments. That's what's comfortable. So I think the problem for most survivors is that when you've been told you're no good, when you've been told nobody will love you but me, and when you've had your sense of self devastated, it's not the easiest thing to then go out and start a new relationship and recognize when your partner isn't healthy enough, and for you to say, no, I have to end this relationship. And so when you've survived being with somebody abusive, whether that's your family of origin or that's, in your dating life, I think it creates a sensitivity and an insecurity that any of us would experience, that then those moments at the beginning of the relationship where the person is, bringing you flowers and they're showering you with gifts and they're calling you at work, that just feels so much like love and what you want. And it's really hard to recognize that that's actually you're being groomed. You're not being wooed. Right. So the second part, do I think victims, and I think the research bears this out, that people are victimized on multiple occasions, not because they're seeking out abusers, but because abusers take advantage of them. Right? The first part is a sometimes, meaning I had just as many clients who had no abuse histories as I did who did have abuse histories. Now, what I usually saw in the clients who didn't have abuse histories was a history of neglect. So like they didn't feel seen by their parents. They didn't have close relationships with their parents. There was indifference from their either their father or their mother. And so I think it's a myth to say that, if you weren't abused, you're not going to be abusive, because there's also, misogyny is a cultural phenomena. And even if you grow up in a healthy home, you can be raised to see women as objects and not as, obviously I've still got this hetero bias, right? And so you can be raised to see the person that you're sexually attracted to and drawn to as an object, as opposed to a human being to have a relationship with and to have shared vulnerable experiences with. And so that's why I think, regardless of whether you've got a neglect history or a trauma history, because some of our clients were like, where's this coming from?
Yeah.
And the best we could determine is it was coming from sort of what they were taught. Right.
You just said something that, if you don't want me to include this, I'll obviously edit this out. But when Jen and I first met, we were friends for a few months, and I had just gotten out of a podcast we could do for 18 hours of me talking about the marriage that I was in. But I was talking to her about like what I learned from that experience and what I know I want and I need in a partner and all these things. And I remember very vividly asking her, what is it that like you're looking for?
I know what you're going to say.
In a person. And what did you say?
I said, I just want someone to be nice to me.
So I talked to her for like 20 minutes about all these attributes and things that I was like looking for, that I know I needed, that I didn't have. And then I asked her the question, and I was expecting like, she just said, and she was dead serious. She just said, I just want someone to be nice to me.
Yep.
And it was also a very scary thing to say to someone.
Yeah.
It was, I felt very brave. I was like, because if this man is not nice to me, like, this is his opportunity. I'm asking for one thing, and if he can't do this one thing, I'm probably going to stick around anyway. But it was I had never had someone say like, what are you looking for in someone? And it was the first and loudest and only thing that came to my mind was, my God, you can be whoever the hell you are. I just need someone to be kind to me.
Yeah.
That's it.
Which, what you just said, Chris, that's why that jumped out to me, because when someone is just kind of staring at their feet because that's all they can do, and they're just like, my baseline, getting in the door, just be nice, you're not looking at the big picture. You're not looking at the person. You're looking at the surface level, the easiest thing they can do. And that's what someone who preys on people, on women and men, this is going to be easy. I just got to be nice for a little bit. Then I got them in the door and they're never leaving.
Yeah. I have said on I'll say it till I'm blue in the face. it's not about seeking out. You just get unlucky,
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
right? You just get unlucky.
Yeah.
That's a powerful perspective shift.
I have found that, sharing some of this stuff with survivors, like light bulbs go off. And then every now and then I'll get emails after training saying, holy shit, like this just everything snapped into focus. Like I started to understand, oh, this was my brain doing what brains do. This was my brain doing what brains do. This was my brain. Oh, that was threat to status. That was threat to status. So this is probably my favorite part of the job is when somebody learns about this stuff and goes, oh, wow, okay. We are so shame-based as survivors, right? I mean, I didn't even tell you what my trauma history was, but my father's a sex offender.
Mm.
So, I mean, you think about saying, my ex-spouse was abusive or my parent was an offender, or, I mean, we are so shame-based around the perpetration of the people who were the source of our own trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And it prevents us from growing and sharing and having moments of emotional intimacy and building relationships, because we're like, what if find out? Like, what if you know? And then, oh my God, you're going to think less of me, and you're going to say, well, why didn't you stay? And why did you see? And why did you? And why did you? As opposed to, oh, I totally get it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think I've been, I mean, every day grateful that you are so patient. And I know that you have your own history with your own traumatic experiences, but it hasn't been what mine have been, and mine haven't been what yours have been. But Tony does his best to at least sit in quietness while I try to share what I'm saying. And at the most is he tries to understand it, and there's patience, and there's not a lot of like follow-up questions, which in a way that sound challenging to me, right? There's follow-up questions in that it's, well, like, what happened next? Or like, how did you there's interest without it feeling challenging or invalidating and
Or intrusive.
Yeah,
intrusive.
intrusive is the word that came to mind, Tony. It's you do it in a way that's not intrusive.
Yeah, and once I removed myself from that previous experience, I was like full steam ahead, like, screw this. I'm not thinking backwards. I'm not talking about it. I barely talk about it with my friends in more ways than, that sucked. Not going to do that again. And even with my own therapists, it takes a while to dive into it, but I see it play out in so many important moments in this relationship. And it is, I talk about shame all of the time. Everything that I do, I have to push through this barrier of shame in order to get to like the actual situation at hand. And when we were thinking about, falling into these other patterns and getting back into relationships with similar people or getting re-abused in a different way, anyone could take advantage of those things. And to be courageous enough to be vulnerable is risking.
It's the scariest part.
Right.
That's
and so,
terrifying.
It sounds silly, but I'm grateful that Tony has not taken advantage of me. Right?
Yes, that doesn't sound silly at all. I think
The crazy part, though, before I like became more aware of like what all of this is, I remember thinking to myself when she told me I just want him to be kind, and I remember saying to her like, your bar is in the basement.
Yeah.
Like, you've got all of these amazing qualities and characteristics, and that's your expectation.
Yeah.
So, and I said that like in jest, not trying to be, inconsiderate of her situation, but that is exactly what like someone who is going to take advantage of somebody like that would see is this person
This is
doesn't
piece of
have
cake.
Yeah, there's no challenge to this. I just need to be able to fog a mirror. And as long as I give him some attention, like, so this conversation has been really enlightening in kind of how you set it up and started with, I see why why people stay and why it
That's
happens to them over and
Yeah.
over and over again. And now even like the idea, and I didn't think this before, but even the idea of like saying it out loud of like, why do they keep seeking that type of person out? It almost makes you feel terrible to even think that somebody would do that. Like
Yep.
they're being sought out. And that's the
Yeah.
problem.
I mean, even that pattern of thinking puts a responsibility back on the victim of
It does.
you're
Yeah,
seeking this
right.
out. This is your pattern that you're now finding.
You know, it just hit me, Jen, when you were talking about everything you do, you have to overcome that shame. And I thought about, yeah, this is why I haven't written a book. This is why I don't like doing a podcast. I don't want to put myself out there because what if people find out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it just hit me that a big step for me personally is being able to say, I don't care. I don't care if people find out. So my reflex, or more my habit, was, we can't have this recorded. People can't know that my father's a sex offender. And then part of me's like, oh, hell no. We absolutely have to keep that in there if it fits.
Some of that's,
Because
like, liberating thing.
yes,
Mhm.
yes. I mean, it's, when I was a psychologist, I was super, super like, I don't want my clients taking care of me. That would be totally inappropriate. And I didn't even want people to know that about me because, oh, how can he be an expert, right? Like, and even now as a trainer, I'm like, oh, what? But I do tell people, I tell audience, like when I train agents, Tony, I'll tell them about the day that I found out my father had been arrested, because it's a great example of central versus peripheral detail and how central details never leave us. So I will disclose, and I don't do it with every audience, because there's some audiences where I'm like, I'm not mapping these people to safety. Fuck no. And there's others like, I'm like, no, I think they would benefit from this. And like, this is going to be okay. I mean, shoot, we could have a whole conversation about that, when people are traumatized, taking on the shame that appropriately should be placed on the person who traumatized us.
Yeah.
And yet we seem to take it on, and they move forward and feel none of it.
In my mind, it was always, well, shit, someone's got to do it. And it was, I'll fill this gap because my brain needs to fill this gap. And I know that I can take it on and it's going to suck, but they're not going to. And I can't live in this abyss of no one taking responsibility. But then now we live in this bubble of shame. And I will also say that I waited until like after the hour mark to start talking about, and I'll talk about this. Get me drunk at a bar, I'll talk about this all day long. But on a platform, we have like 4 followers, I think. But on a platform,
Well, we haven't published it yet.
we haven't published anything.
I know the
but
feeling.
even to put it on any sort of forward-facing platform other than private conversations,
Yeah.
this is brand new for me as well, and
Yeah.
so it's. Who knows where it's going to go, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, Chris, and thank you for sharing that part of your story. When you said that, because that's the first time I had heard it, and I feel this every time somebody shares something, some intimate detail about their personal life, in that type of way, and it's immediate sense of almost like a connection that you can't get without that level of vulnerability. And
Yeah.
and that's kind of what's ironic about it. It's the opposite of what the person's fear is if they tell someone how it's going to be received. It actually
Yeah.
brings them closer to the person who receives it. And it's not out of pity. It's out of,
Nope.
wow, like this,
Yep.
it's experience that you've lived, you've been resilient, you've overcome, you've dealt with it, you deal with it continuously. And now you can help other people, and they believe you because you understand,
Yeah, when we started out the podcast earlier today, I don't think I said this out loud, but one of the things that was in the back of my mind was, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk about the work that I did with abusive men, because they have, that work has informed everything, professionally and personally. And now I'm realizing that that's actually not entirely accurate. My father wasn't just a sex offender. My father struggled hugely with narcissism. Empathy was foreign to him. He was incredibly psychologically abusive. And that experience as a kid is what then informed all of my work with. There was a reason I was so good at working with those guys, because I lived with one. You know, he wasn't abusive to my mom, at least not that I'm aware of. But to me personally, it was an interesting existence. And so disclosing that and being upfront about the fact that it has informed and shaped the way that I see the world is really terrifying, and also like you said, like, yeah, okay. I imagine people can connect to that as opposed to go, ugh, that guy's a freak.
Yeah, and the very small percentage of population that may have that type of response, fuck those people.
That is, yes,
and
fuck them.
That's the liberating aspect of just being yourself and sharing your story, and the amount of people you're going to help and remove shame from by hearing somebody talk about that they've been through something similar or uniquely challenging, versus the amount of people that you're going to make feel more insecure in their already insecure disposition. Like, who the hell cares about those people?
Yep.
It's such a more powerful story for the ones that you're going to help.
This might be a Dr. Seuss thing. Oh my gosh, this might be lame. The quote, it says something like those that mind don't matter and those that matter don't mind.
Yeah,
so like the people that this resonates with, those are the people you want with you anyway, and the people that either aren't aware enough socially or or just don't have the capacity to hold space for someone sharing something that big, we don't want them in ours. I don't want to hear your advice or suggestions or care anyway. Yeah. Right? Like,
yeah, you know, it's so fascinating. I spoke with somebody earlier today, and I told, you know, when Tony and I first got on the call, I had said, you know, today's been a rough day. And part of that is related to finding out that a friend of mine's cancer diagnosis is terminal or damn near. And then part of that was talking to a mom who had 2 kids who were abused and sexually by her ex-husband. And this conversation, part of what we talked about was how, like, these logical messages that we have in our head, they just, we can't seem to always grasp them and live by them. Like, I so wish that I could say, I live by that all the time. You know, that notion of, you know, those that, you know, mind don't matter and those that matter don't mind. But God bless America. The insecurity and the shame and the fear, I don't seem to be able to like rationalize my way out of it, if that makes sense.
yeah.
And it's like I have to kind of sit with it and just let it be, and then it sort of starts to dissolve. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because it's a challenge that I've worked with for as long as I can remember.
Yeah.
You know, what if people find out? What will they think of me when they're, you know?
Well, that goes back to your notion of a threat of status, of our brain's job. Ideally, it would be to rationalize and to be logical, but our brain's job is to keep us safe. And
you got that.
And it's to seek out threat and to protect us from those things. And, you know, it's not a saber-toothed tiger that's chasing us down our little cave anymore. It's a lifetime of trauma, and sharing any part of it is vulnerable, and it's a threat to status and a threat to safety. So it makes perfect sense that we would say, nope, I'm going to tuck that back. That's not coming out in this conversation.
And I think too, particularly for any of us that are in a helping profession, you know, will people feel comfortable hiring me as a psychologist if they find out that I'm fucked up? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And notice the language there, right? I don't say, will people hire me if they find out that I've been fucked with?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Same thing as a trainer. Are people going to hire me as a trauma trainer if they find out what my trauma history is? And I think logically the answer is hell yes, they are.
More so.
Because then,
yeah.
You're not speaking just from academic experience. You're speaking from like practical experience as well. So,
Yeah. For people, we touch on a ton of different stuff, and I know you do a lot of training and you get involved, you got your hands involved in a lot of different things. How would you recommend listeners being able to get in touch with you if they'd like to learn?
See what you're up to.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. You can see this is my own podcast joke.
Yeah.
You mentioned your listener. So let your parents know that if they want to email me.
My parents probably won't even listen to this.
Oh my God. My mom will. She'll call me.
Oh, that's I love that.
It's a joke I used in my own podcast.
That's
I'm like,
so
I really
good, man.
appreciate you listening, Mom and Dad. So, people can do one of two things. They can either go to my website, which is beingti.com, beingtraumainformed.com, or they can just email me, chris@beingti.com, CHRIS. And if I can also put in a plug for Larry Awesome. One of the ways that I have part of my resilience practice is to be a musician. And so like Tony, I sent you.
Yes. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about that at the beginning. We went on.
Well, so the group of folks that I compose and write and record with, we decided in a moment of rum-induced madness that we were going to name ourselves Larry Awesome, who's not really a person. It's sort of like Steely Dan or Pink Floyd.
That's her dad's name. So
His name was Larry.
Is it?
Larry. Yeah.
And he's awesome, isn't he?
He is awesome. Yeah.
See,
Awesome.
there you go. So anyway, so we released our first single. And so if people wanted to go to larryawesome.com,
Heck yeah.
they can hear.
I'll put your Being Trauma Informed, your contact information, and a link to the Larry Awesome on for Spotify in the show notes.
Oh, very cool.
For our parents to see.
Yeah.
So
My dad Larry will love that website.
Oh, that's great, man. All right, Chris. Well, thank you so much. This was amazing. So we really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolute pleasure. Jen, really good to meet you. And I appreciate your vulnerability. And I look forward to connecting with both of you.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Tell Us More About That. Don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform it is that you're listening to us on, and also leave us a rating and review.
If you have any topics you would like us to consider, if you have any feedback or commentary, only if it's positive, please visit www.tellusmoreaboutthat.com.
Thanks again for joining in, and we will see you next time.
See ya.